Today we are going to take some dahlia cuttings. Now don't worry if your dahlias are not ready yet. I started some of mine off a little bit earlier so that I'll be able to demonstrate to you and you'll have a chance to watch it before your tubers are ready for cuttings. Now there are lots of ways that you can take dahlia cuttings. The way that I'm going to show you is the most foolproof way, but you can take them further up the stem as long as the stem is solid. You can take them from a node or also internodal cuttings. However, the problem that I found is that the success rate is significantly reduced, especially if you're new to cuttings. You'll have to take a lot of cuttings for not that many successes, and they don't always create a tuber, and without a tuber you're not going to be able to keep them. So I'm going to show you how to take a cutting for the maximum success, but as I say, there are other ways that you can do it. It does mainly tend to be breeders that will take nodal or internodal cuttings, and the main reason that they would do that is because they would be fixing a sport. Now what that means is when a plant, and you might have seen it happen in your own gardens, you've got a dahlia and it's growing beautifully, and then suddenly a flower on the same stem comes up a different colour. And I'm going to put an image on the screen for you now where you can see that I had that happen to one of my Caroline Wagamans. It came through half pink and half apricot. I would have liked it to have come through completely pink because I think we're really missing a water lily dahlia of that colour in the market. Hasn't happened to me since, but I'm keeping my eyes peeled. And if it ever does happen again, I will take a cutting from that part of the plant in the hope that the cutting is successful and I'm able to fix that spot. But I won't hold my breath. So I'm just going to show you my little setup here. I have got my dahlia for cuttings. I've got some multi-purpose compost. I've got some perlite this time because that's very good when you're taking cuttings for adding moisture around the root zone. I've got hormone rooting powder to help accelerate the rooting process. I've got some 9cm pots, some labels, a pen, and I've got some scalpels here because I find these are from eBay. They're very cheap and mine last me for years. I just keep them in these little packets. It really helps getting in really close when taking a cutting and nicking a bit of that tuber because they're super sharp. I'm adding perlite to the compost on this occasion because as well as adding drainage and aeration to the soil, it also helps keep moisture around the root zone area. And the hormone rooting powder, what that does is accelerates the rooting process. So you don't have to add either product if you don't want to. I just find that it speeds up the process and increases my chances of cutting success. Before I start, I've just created myself a little tray of water, and all it is an upturned propagator lid in a tray, and I filled it with water to create a bath for my cuttings. And you can see I've tipped this dahlia out of the pot, ready for surgery. So I've got my tuber here and you overhead so you can see properly, and there are potentially a couple of cuttings that I could take from this plant. There's one here, but can you see it's not really grown very much yet, so that's worth revisiting later. And then over this side, this is a much stronger shoot, so I've taken away as much of the soil as I can so I can get as close to the tuber as I possibly can. And then I'm going to use my scalpel to slice as close as possible, taking a tiny little sliver of tuber with me for maximum success. Now you'll be able to see why I like the scalpel so much. It's sharp and it's precise. So I'm going to get in there and I'm just going to cutting off. Can you see? Look at that. What a clean wound that is. So now we're going to remove some of the foliage. Right, I've popped you in the cradle so hopefully you can see. I'm going to take my scalpel and I'm just going to remove some of this foliage because this is how the cutting will lose water through its leaves. So if you reduce the leaf surface area, you will reduce the risk of water leaving the plant. There we go. Whoops. This is what the water's for. If you've got a few cuttings that you want to do, you can just drop that in for a swim. And actually I find the cuttings take better, as long as you don't leave it in here for too long. But any water that we've lost while we've been chatting can now have a chance to be reabsorbed by the plant for maximum rehydration before we pot the cutting up. I'm just gonna repot the mother plant up. It won't even notice. It's got less stems now, and we can pop that back to grow. So next I'm going to get my pot and I'm going to mix my perlite and my compost about 50-50. Now I'm mixing it, you're probably thinking to yourself, oh, I've seen plants with compost like that at the garden centre. You have. This is how the professionals do it. There we go. Now I've just added some hormone rooting powder to the pot because this cutting's wet, so the hormone rooting powder is going to stick really nicely to it. But you don't want to dunk it in your pot because it's like talcum powder and the pot will just get ruined and turn solid. And I'm going to dib a nice hole. I'm going to go around the edge because the drainage will be better from the edge and you're less likely to overwater your cutting. And I'm just going to sink it in, and I can add several to the edge of this pot. Another tuber to show you here, and you might be able to see if you look closely, it's already got 5 stems. Now it does depend entirely on the size of the tuber. Some tubers are big enough to easily support 5 stems, however this one here is struggling. Can you see we've got nice big stems until you get to the last 2, and this one here in particular is looking very weedy indeed. So by taking it out, you're going to do the plant a favour, and by taking a cutting you'll also get a free plant at the same time. Again, I'm going to go in as low as I can, see if I can just nick a little bit of the tuber, because you don't want that away to reshoot anyway. The plant's already telling you that it can't support it. There we go, look at that. Oh my goodness, and we've even got a little bit of root. Guaranteed success then, fantastic. Pop him in for a swim and then we see if we can get one more. I think this one here in the middle looks the weakest, so I think we'll go ahead and take that, and also I can see a little bit of root there, so let's just go in as low as we can with our scalpel and just slice really gently. There we go. Absolutely fantastic. Oh, tiny bit of root again. Absolutely magic. In for a swim. And then what I will do with these 2 cuttings is exactly the same as I did before, and I will remove this foliage, and this foliage here to reduce the transpiration. But luckily they do have a root, so I'll be very surprised if we don't have guaranteed success. So let's remove our foliage again. There we go. There we go. And again, the sharp scalpel is making sure that I don't make a mess and create a nasty wound. It is a bit like surgery, isn't it? Let's take that off there. That one off there, trying to be careful not to take the main shoot. And then this one here, just those 2 off. I brought my pot back. Now you can give them all separate pots if you want to. Need a big hole for this cutting because it's got a bit of root, but the foliage is very different on both these cuttings, and I'm very familiar with the plants, so I can tell on site which variety is which. I'll put a label in as well, and I'll put a separate label in for these 2. But when I come to divide them up, I will know. Also, I can watch my video back, can't I? Give them a tap to make sure that the compost is in complete contact with the cutting. Add your label, and it's ready for a water. I've got one last example here that I've just given a wash for you so you can see really clearly. So here's your cutting. You can see how it's attached to the tuber, and this was the eye. So the idea is you take your cutting as close as you can to the tuber if you want the eye to reshoot. If you're not bothered about the eye reshooting and you want maximum success, then you would put your scalpel in here and you would take out the cutting with this piece of tuber intact. You can also see that this is the old stem, so it's not doing anything. This is an old piece of tuber, so that's last year's tuber. That's not doing anything. This is the new tuber, and the eye is attached to these new storage tubers. Cutting doesn't have any way of taking up any moisture until it puts down roots. So it's a race against time to prevent the cutting from drying out before the roots are formed. And the easiest way to do that is to put it in a propagator. Do you remember when we were sowing the seeds, the propagator lid almost immediately created a humid environment? That humid environment will slow down transpiration, and that's the loss of water from the plant's leaves, hopefully buying us enough time for the cutting to take before it runs out of water, and then will grow on to create a successful plant. There we go, and then just pop those in the propagator to keep the humidity around their leaves. Fast forward a couple of days, I just wanted to show you my cuttings. They're looking really good. And what I've done is I've actually taken them up to the house because it's a bit warm in the greenhouse at the moment and I was worried they were going to wilt. So I took them up to the house, and I didn't have a propagator lid that was tall enough or clean enough, frankly. So I've improvised, and this is a nice large jar. It's just from IKEA. I normally keep my tea bags in it. And I think it looks quite posh. It's a Victorian propagator. Obviously the Victorians had no plastic, so they would have used glass. So there's nothing new in this, but I thought I'd share it with you just in case that might come in handy for you as well. My cuttings look really good. I'm just taking the lid off to let a bit of air get to the cuttings, because otherwise it will all go stale in here. I'm going to just keep them just out of direct sunlight so that they don't go and wilt on me. But yeah, looking good. So these are the same 3 plants that I took cuttings from 1 week on. And look at that, they look absolutely smashing. This plant is able to grow freely with the reduced number of stems. This mother plant is looking gorgeously healthy. And this was the dahlia that I rinsed all the compost off. So just have a look at the foliage. It's nice and thick, it's nice and green. If your foliage doesn't look like this, you might not have them in the right location. So it needs to be a light, bright greenhouse with plenty of ventilation and frost free. Luckily, it's been like that naturally. So I've got here the cuttings that I took earlier on in the season, and you can see now how big they are. They need their own pots and they also need pinching out. So I'm going to do that now. There we are. Look at that lovely nest of roots. So what I'm going to do is very carefully just tease these apart, keeping as much of the roots as I can around each of the cuttings. So now I'm going to give each one its own pot, and I think I'm going to go with a 1 litre pot to start with. So I'm positioning him in the middle. I'm going to hold him between my fingers, and then I'm going to just filter the compost in all around. There we are, just give that a firm. And now the nerve-wracking bit, we're going to chop his head off. 3, 2, 1. There we go. Perfect. So I thought now would be the perfect time to revisit some of the dahlias that we together pinched out earlier. Here we go. So you can see the wound is very quickly disappearing in amongst the new shoots. So we've taken out that one single stem and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 branches coming up instead. Absolutely fantastic.